change is really scary. As
Yeah.
humans, we generally don't like change. And when change happens, there's this uncertainty of who am I? Because I'm not that person anymore,
Yeah.
but I don't know who I'm going to be. So it sounds really powerful what you help your clients with.
Thank
And
you.
you mentioned the science and having that spiritual connection to it. Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. And I think you really paraphrased that well, of like how we're all kind of like leery of change until it happens to us, and then we're like, oh, what do I do with this? So I'm very well versed in that. Well, I'll start actually in childhood because I think some of our listeners are going to resonate with this. And they may have never put their finger on it or they may have ignored it, but I was a kid who had past life memories. And so I had, as a child, five, six, seven. It started to end around eight, nine, 10. But I just would have these little glimpses of a life, and it would be a daydream. And it would maybe, I'm looking back now, recognizing like actually it was triggered sometimes. Like sometimes it would come out of nowhere. Maybe, but I would also trigger it accidentally by doing certain things. And so they always felt more real than real. They weren't based on like a movie. It was like I would almost inhabit somebody else for a temporary moment and then I would get out. And I would chat about it with my parents, and they were really, they didn't like poo-poo it. They kind of like laughed and were like, oh, okay, that's Katie. But there was a couple of times, but when I was, young, one of the ways that I would trigger a memory was I used to like to play in my backyard next to a really big oak tree, and I would create these like what I called huts, where I would take like big branches and I would lay it on the tree trunk, and then I would fill in the branches with these little sticks, and I would go in it. And I would create these little like mud huts. I would put mud on the inside so no water could get through. And it just came naturally to me. But what happened while I was making that is I would go back into this memory of being a small boy with like darker skin. And I was having memories of like skinning a rabbit and like being able to take the fur off of the rabbit. And it was just so like, the whole process. And then I would go back to my like building my hut. And it was interesting because I never really thought it was weird. I was just like, that was me back then, and I didn't really have that self-consciousness yet. And so it was just very natural to me. And so that story evolves later, and I'll put that as like a little pin if you're like, tell me more about it. But the spiritual connection was I felt as if I, as a child, had memories that I had come from somewhere perfect. And I think I'm noticing that now with my daughter. Like she's almost like disgusted by a lot of humanity. And she's 8 years old. She's nearly 8 years old. And she'll be like, I can't believe we're doing this, and this. That's just not fair. That's not right. And I think there's like a sense that highly sensitive people, empaths, like people who kind of lean a little bit more spiritually, we're almost born with this memory of this is not what we came from. Right. And the more work I do in my profession now as an adult, I see that we are remembering a perfect time and a perfect place in a space that we can exist in another realm, in another form of our being as an eternal being. And like, I think as a child, I kind of remembered that. And there were little things here and there where you kind of hold this belief system and then potentially you get exposed to things that validate it. And I remember like so clearly, I was so young. I was like maybe, oh gosh, like 12 years old, and I was in an English class, and my teacher was discussing Plato, the philosopher's like understanding of the world of ideals and how all of us come from this beautiful world, and then we go through a veil of forgetfulness, and then we are become on Earth, and we can't remember all of that, and then when we're on Earth, we have to kind of like relearn how to be in a human body. And I was only 12 years old, and I was like, that's it. Yeah, that's where I'm remembering that, and it's like I found like who am I talking to about this? Like I felt very lonely because I had these memories of these things. And so I kind of went along in life like as you do. I was always kind of esoterically bent, meaning like I would go to the library and find all of the like hidden knowledge books, and I would be like flipping through in the stacks about like Bigfoot and Atlantis and past lives and things like anything that like could strike me, I was like reading about. And I kind of let some of that go when I was in more of my science phase because you really have to kind of get into a materialist view. I didn't let it go completely as a potential, but I kind of had to focus a little bit more on like birds' level of cortisol and like, an amoeba's ability to swim in water. Like I had to like be a little bit more focused there. But when I was 28 years old, I was a scientist at the time. I was teaching science. I just had this like what I think is like a Saturn returns if you're into astrology, but it was like kind of an existential crisis, right? And I was in a church, and I'm not a churchgoer. I was just I just happened to be in a church as a tourist, and I said, like God, like I got a lot of existential angst here. What am I supposed to do? I feel so like, stuck and like I have to know something and I don't, and like what is going on? And I heard very clearly, you need to check into your past lives. And I was in a church, so I was kind of like, come again? I was like, are you sure about this? Jesus, is that you? But it was very clear. It was like like an inner knowing, and it was in my right ear, and it's like you need to check into your past lives. So when I returned home from the tourist, the church, I, Googled somebody near me, and it was a hypnotherapist, and she brought me into my first past life regression. And it was very clear. It was not a memory that I had as a child, but it was a life where I was like a young boy. I was living in Scotland. I grew up to be a man who got married. I had children. I was a carpenter. I could like feel the plane of the wood as I was like, making it flatter. It was very visceral, very real experience. And when I was finished, the hypnotherapist was like, "You're really good at this. You should consider returning for our Life Between Lives session." And I was like, "I don't know about that." Like I gotta process this. I was still young and I wanted to integrate and really make sense of it. And I waited one full year to do another session, but in that year, everything in my life started to like align and make more sense. And all these little pieces from my childhood started to make sense. And I think like I began to like remember more than figure out of like, yeah, oh, right. Yeah, I chose this life. Oh, yeah. Like I have, so when I went into the next session 1 year later, that purpose is, and these are sessions I offer now as a professional, but it's like that was a lot more where you're trying to figure out, why did you choose this life? And where do you go when you're not alive? And how many other lives you got? And why do you have the people that you have in your life? What are your contracts with them, et cetera, et cetera. And that was when I was 29 years old, and it was so profound that it felt like without a shadow of a doubt I needed then now to use that to like springboard me. And a lot of what I learned in that session was actually quite prophetic. And I hadn't experienced, it says you're going to have a girl and a boy, and I didn't even want children yet. And I was like, really? That ended up happening. It's like you're going to live all over the world. I hadn't lived all over the world yet, and that ended up happening. And it had a couple of things that were kind of sad, that still haven't happened about like when my dad passes away. And so, it showed me what I was capable of handling, but also it showed me a framework that I kind of live my life by now. And that's kind of how we started this, is that like, okay, I did choose this life. I chose to make a big impact. I chose to focus on relationships. I chose to focus on healing things in my lineage. And throughout my life now as an adult, a lot of the things that happened in that original session for me not only have come true, but they've become more and more like foundational to my life. And so the way that I kind of like to go back to your original question of like how I kind of combine that with science is my PhD focus, well, I'll actually rewind even more. My undergrad and master's degree was in science, and that was very heavy on data of like, you got to measure this and you got to know how many of this. And it was very material and like, and very probably good way for me. I had to learn material evidence. But my PhD was in something that you needed phenomenological evidence. Super fun to say that word, phenomenological. But what it is just direct evidence, where it is the very beginning of creation of theories and hypotheses and understanding, is when you have direct evidence, and it's usually from a human being like, I got this thing happening to me. And instead of us just overlooking it, we take it very seriously and we try to get as many other people as we can that have the same phenomenon going on in their life. And then we say, pattern, we have a pattern here. We need to understand this. And then that becomes a place of study. And so, where I find a lot of my work now is kind of intersecting with like earlier versions of my life is the more clients I take and the more sessions that people have in this other realm, I'm like, what the F is this? Right? You're like, and the science brain is like, I want to map this place. Like I want to have all of this figured out because it's like there are patterns. And we can talk about that maybe in another question, but like there are patterns. There are things that every single person, no matter where they're from, experiences. There are ways of describing things that like people don't know another person that I've seen like for, several hours before ex described it one way and then another person describes it another way. So I can't help but leave my little science brain on and be like, there is phenomenological evidence that this is real. And I think that really helps me believe that are these things metaphors? Yeah, maybe your mind is making up a metaphor. I'm happy to entertain that as a reality. Happy for that to be what hypnotherapy sessions are about is metaphors. But the scientist in me is like, we're going somewhere. We're going somewhere. We're tapping something. We're meeting people. We're meeting things that are real. And so that begs the question, well, what is it? Right? And that's why I love my job.
I love your explanation. I don't think we've ever had anyone, and we had people who are kind of bridging, the science into the different realms. They're tapping onto different planes and different approaches. But I don't think we've ever had anyone so beautifully describing, even different scientific lenses from, oh, we need all the data and we need confirmation from, how many, we look at studies, how many people did we have in the study? What is the double blind? What is
Right.
the limits? Whatever, what's happening in there? Versus, oh, we have an outlier. Let's not completely ignore this one off. Let's be like, okay, what is it telling me? And is there more of them? And then let
Yeah.
me see what we can build from there.
Yeah. Thanks. And you know what's interesting? As you were speaking, I just got this image. So I'm gonna kind of I'm thinking and speaking at the same time, so bear with me. But my daughter has a hamster right now. And as everyone can imagine in their mind, a hamster in a tank with a little wheel. And I'm watching this hamster and it's like living in a very contrived environment, right? And I had a friend say to me like, "Oh, have you ever seen a hamster in the wild?" And I said, "Yeah, actually I have. When I was a scientist in Mongolia, hamsters were all over the place. Hamsters, gerbils, that's where they're from." And they're the most creative, cunning, clever little characters that you can ever imagine. And they would never, their energy and aura and spirit would never be captured in a little tank with a wheel, right? And so I recognize there is something that science, quote unquote, does that is akin to putting a hamster in a tank, right? We try really hard to replicate or sterilize or test or study something in a like small box. And what I'm noticing is there's like this a beautiful energy and aura about humanity and our souls and our spirits that is happening out in the real world and in the wild. And I think that's kind of what I feel I tap into with my coaching clients and my hypnotherapy clients and my somatic clients. Like we're doing stuff that's more real and you can't uh, dilute that um, into these little sterile boxes. And I guess I'm quite sensitive to that right now because I'm recognizing, some of us are becoming a little bit more attracted to like AI and things like that for our mental and emotional wellness. And I find that's really good for some of us because maybe, we've got a lot of fear around a person judging us or whatever. And the computer feels really, lack of judgment, which is great. But there is a very alive, beautiful, like energetic component to the work that we do. And we run the risk of losing that sometimes when we try to automate it or create like little boxes for it to live in. And I really don't want to go in that direction.